Somewhere underneath a city of 2 million people, a piece of rock the size of Rhode Island is stuck. It hasn't moved in decades. It's not supposed to move for a while longer. But new data from underneath Seattle just told scientists that a while longer might mean something very different than they thought. Picture the whole Puget Sound region as a stack of dinner plates, and someone is slowly, steadily pushing that stack sideways across a table. Most of the time, the plates grind past each other in tiny, harmless shuffles you'd never feel. But every so often, one plate catches on another. It doesn't slide, it locks. And the pushing doesn't stop just because the plate is stuck. The force keeps building plate against plate with nowhere to go. That's the Seattle fault. And I know the title of this video sounds like scientists just found some brand new monster fault nobody knew about, but that's not quite the full picture. This fault has been known for decades. And what's new is what they found when they looked closer at how it's been storing energy. And it's forcing a rethink of what overdue actually means for the region sitting right on top of it. By the end of this video, you're going to understand 3 things. First, how a fault can sit directly under a major skyline and stay basically invisible for a century. Second, the actual detective work, the swamp mud, the drowned trees, and the oral histories that scientists used to prove this fault has done this before, and violently. And third, what the newest research changes about how soon again might be. I want to be upfront about something before we go any further. This video is going to spend its first half walking you through some genuinely unsettling science. That's on purpose. I'd rather you sit with the real picture for a few minutes than get a fake, comfortable version of it. But I promise you, we end this video in a very different place than we started, with what you can actually do about it. So stay with me through the hard part. It's worth it. Let's start with where this fault actually is, because that's the part that surprises people most. When most people think Pacific Northwest earthquake, they think of the big offshore monster, the Cascadia subduction zone, the fault where the ocean floor is sliding underneath the continent, way out past the coast. That one's real, and it's enormous, and we'll talk about how it fits into this story. But the Seattle fault isn't offshore. It runs directly underneath the city. It cuts east to west, right through the heart of downtown, under the stadiums, under the ferry terminals, under neighborhoods where people are making coffee and walking their dogs right now, completely unaware they're standing over a seam in the Earth's crust. Here's the mechanism, and I want you to picture that stack of dinner plates being pushed sideways again, because we're going to come back to it. The Pacific Northwest sits at the edge of a slow-motion collision. Way out to the west, one massive piece of ocean floor, think of it as the very bottom plate in our stack, is sliding underneath the plate that North America sits on. That process is called subduction, and all it really means is one slab of rock is getting shoved beneath another slab of rock, inch by inch, year after year. That grinding, distant collision doesn't just stay out at the coast. It pushes the whole region, squeezing the crust of the Pacific Northwest like a hand slowly pressing down on that stack of plates from the side. Something has to give, and what gives closer to the surface are smaller faults like the one under Seattle, cracks in the crust that absorb some of that squeezing by cracking, shifting, and occasionally violently letting go. Most of the time you would never know it's there. The two sides of the fault are locked together by friction, like two rough surfaces pressed hard against each other. They're not sliding smoothly, they're catching. And while they're caught, the pushing force from that distant collision doesn't disappear. It keeps loading into the rock, the same way you keep loading energy into a rubber band the longer you stretch it and don't let go. The band isn't moving, but it is absolutely not doing nothing. It's storing every bit of that pull, waiting for the moment it either slips a little or snaps all at once. That's the entire mechanism behind a fault like this. Squeeze, lock, load, and eventually release. The question that keeps scientists up at night isn't whether it releases. It's when, and how much energy will have piled up by the time it does. Now here's where the detective story comes in, because for most of the last century, nobody had solid proof this fault had ever ruptured in a way big enough to matter. It was mapped. It was known to exist. But we can see a crack in the rock, and we know this crack has caused a massive earthquake, are two very different claims, and scientists needed real evidence, not just a suspicious-looking line on a geological map. The first clue came from something you wouldn't expect: dead trees standing straight up underwater. In the tidal flats and river valleys around Puget Sound, researchers found what are called ghost forests, stands of tree trunks still rooted in place, still standing upright but drowned, killed not by fire, not by disease, but by suddenly being dropped down into salt water that shouldn't have reached them. Trees don't grow underwater. So if you find a forest that's still standing exactly where it grew, but it's now sitting below the tide line, something moved the ground out from under it, fast enough that the trees died in place. Instead of falling over or rotting away first, That's consistent with a very specific event. A big earthquake on a fault like this one can cause the ground on one side to drop suddenly, sometimes by several feet, in a matter of seconds. A forest that used to sit safely above the tide can end up permanently below it overnight. The trees that scientists found weren't just old. When they measured them using tree ring dating, they found the drowning event lined up almost precisely with the same time window as a mysterious tsunami that showed up in an entirely different part of the world's historical record, one that Japanese coastal villages had documented centuries ago, with no known local earthquake to explain it. That's the part that turns this from a geology story into a genuine mystery with a reveal. For a long time, that unexplained tsunami in Japan was just that, unexplained. Then scientists studying the Pacific Northwest coastline found their own evidence. Buried layers of sand in coastal marshes, sandwiched inside layers of regular soil. The unmistakable fingerprint of a wave, violent enough to scoop up beach sand and dump it far inland, followed by decades of normal, quiet dirt piling back on top like nothing happened. When they matched the timing of that buried sand layer with the timing of the drowned forest, and then matched both of those with the timing of the unexplained tsunami on the other side of the Pacific, all three lined up. A massive earthquake had hit the Pacific Northwest, dropped the coastline, drowned a forest, and sent a wave all the way across the ocean to Japan, roughly 3 centuries ago. That particular event is tied to the offshore Cascadia fault, the big one, not the Seattle fault specifically. But it's what convinced scientists to take every fault in the system seriously, including the one running directly under the city. And once they went looking specifically for evidence from the Seattle fault itself, they found it. Layers of jumbled, chaotic soil consistent with a sudden landslide into a lake, timed to roughly 1,100 years ago. A raised, tilted shoreline that used to be at sea level and now sits well above it, exactly the kind of uplift you'd expect if one whole side of the fault had suddenly jacked upward during a rupture. And oral histories from indigenous communities in the region passed down for generations, describing the ground shaking violently and the water behaving strangely. Accounts that modern geologists now treat as real environmental data, not just folklore, because they keep lining up with what the physical evidence shows. So this is not a hypothetical fault, it's a proven one. It ruptured catastrophically around 1,100 years ago, hard enough to raise entire sections of coastline and drop others straight into the water. Now, let's talk numbers, because a number by itself means nothing, and I don't want to just throw magnitudes at you and move on. Scientists estimate that ancient rupture was somewhere in the range of a magnitude 7 event, possibly higher. Here's what that means in real terms. Earthquake magnitude isn't a simple straight line scale, it's closer to compounding interest. Each whole number up releases roughly 32 times more energy than the number below it. So, a magnitude 7 isn't just a little worse than a magnitude 6 you might have felt on the news somewhere. It releases roughly 32 times the energy. And unlike a distant offshore Cascadia earthquake, which has to travel through miles of rock and water before it reaches the coast and loses some punch along the way, a Seattle fault earthquake happens directly underneath the buildings people are standing in. Shallow, close, and violent, with very little distance to soften the blow, to make that even more real. Engineers who study ground shaking describe an event like this producing violent shaking for well over 30 seconds, directly under downtown Seattle. 30 seconds doesn't sound like much until you try standing on a bus that's braking hard for 30 straight seconds, while the ground itself is doing the shaking instead of the brakes. I do want to pause here and knock down something you've probably already thought, because it's the single most common misunderstanding about earthquake science. And if I don't address it, it'll sit in the back of your mind the rest of this video. No, scientists cannot predict exactly when this will happen. Not the year, not the month, not the week. Anyone online telling you they know the exact date of the big one is not a seismologist. They're a guesser with a headline. What scientists actually do is closer to what an insurance actuary does with car accidents. They can't tell you the exact day you'll get in a fender bender. But based on hundreds of thousands of drivers, road conditions, and history, they can tell you the odds over a certain number of years. And those odds are useful, even without a specific date attached. That's exactly what's happening here. Nobody's predicting a date. They're calculating rising odds based on stored energy and past behavior, the same way you'd trust a doctor telling you your cholesterol trend is concerning, even without them naming the exact day of a heart attack. Okay, here's the part. That's actually reassuring, because I promised you this wouldn't just escalate in a straight line. Not every part of the region sits equally on top of this risk. Building codes across Washington have changed dramatically since the 1970s, specifically because of research like this. Newer buildings, especially hospitals, schools, and major bridges built or retrofitted in the last 2 decades, are engineered with this exact fault in mind. Seattle didn't just discover this fault and shrug. City engineers have spent years quietly retrofitting older masonry. buildings, reinforcing bridges, and rewriting codes specifically because of what the ghost forests and buried sand layers revealed. This isn't a city that's caught totally flat-footed. A lot of very serious, unglamorous engineering work has already happened in the background. But here's the second wave, the consequence people usually don't think about. And it's not really about the shaking itself. It's about what happens right after. Seattle is built on a lot of reclaimed land in Softville, especially around the waterfront and industrial areas near the port. That kind of ground is vulnerable to something called liquefaction. And here's the plain version of what that word means. When loose, waterlogged soil gets shaken hard enough, for long enough, it can briefly stop behaving like solid ground and start behaving almost like a liquid. The same way wet sand at the beach turns soupy and swallows your foot if you stomp on it rhythmically enough. Buildings, pipelines, and roads sitting on that kind of ground don't just shake. During an earthquake, they can sink, tilt, or crack apart afterward, even in areas that felt only moderate shaking compared to spots built on solid bedrock. That's the compounding risk that doesn't show up in a simple magnitude number. It's not just how hard the ground shakes, it's what kind of ground you happen to be standing on when it does. And there's a slower moving version of this risk too, one that plays out over days, not seconds. A major rupture directly under a dense urban core can damage the very systems a city needs most in the aftermath. Water mains, which are often older, cast iron pipes vulnerable to shifting ground, and the bridges connecting parts of the city separated by water. Seattle is a city built around water, which means some of its most critical connections run over bridges that could be damaged or closed for inspection right when people need to move the most, whether that's getting to a hospital or getting home to family. I want to bring the tension back down again because that's genuinely the last of the scary escalation in this video, and there's something important on the other side of it. None of what I just described is destiny. It's exactly the kind of risk that gets meaningfully smaller the more prepared a household is. And that's not me being falsely comforting. That's just how disaster outcomes actually work, over and over, in every major earthquake zone that's been studied. Preparation doesn't stop the ground from shaking. It changes what happens to you in the hours and days after it does, which is usually where the real danger lives anyway. So let's talk about what actually changes outcomes, because I don't want to leave you with dread and nothing to do with it. The single biggest factor in earthquake survival research, over and over again, isn't some dramatic go bag with 40 items in it. It's water. Experts recommend having at least a gallon per person per day for a minimum of 2 weeks, not the old 3-day number you might have heard. Because bridge and water main damage in a scenario like this can realistically take longer than 3 days to fully repair. Store it somewhere low and stable, not on a high shelf that could fall. Second, know where your gas and water shutoff valves are physically, right now, before anything happens. A huge number of house fires after major earthquakes come from ruptured gas lines that nobody knew how to shut off in the chaos of the moment. This takes 5 minutes to learn today and could matter enormously later. Third, have a battery or hand crank radio and know your region's actual emergency frequency, because cell networks are often the first thing to get overwhelmed or knocked out in a major disaster, right when everyone is trying to use them at once. And fourth, and this is the one people skip the most, talk to your actual neighbors now, before anything happens, about a simple plan. Who has medical training? Who has a generator? Where you'd meet if phones don't work. Community response, not individual heroics, is consistently what separates neighborhoods that recover fast from neighborhoods that don't. None of this requires panic. It requires about 1 afternoon of your time. So let's go back to that rubber band, stretched tight, held in place by friction, quietly storing energy it hasn't spent yet. That's not a metaphor for doom. It's a metaphor for a system that is understood, studied, and increasingly prepared for by people who've spent careers reading the evidence buried in swamp mud and drowned trees, so the rest of us don't have to guess. The ground under Seattle has done this before. The evidence is unmistakable, and the honest, unglamorous work of getting ready for it again is already happening, in building codes and retrofits, and now, hopefully, in your own home too. The fault isn't asking permission, but you get to decide how ready you are when it finally lets go.